Order.
Yeah.
But when we look at the phenomenon of the New World, Steiner's idea was, Henrik, that history is actually not what the Marxists say. It's not abstractions. It's not the dialectic. It's not the movement of class consciousness. It's not dialectical materialism. It's not these kind of grey abstractions. Yeah, history is the deeds of beings, concrete beings, and whether these concrete beings are concrete spiritual beings or concrete human beings. We are also spiritual beings, but they are beings. And that means that beings have intentions and then they act out on these intentions. So wherever we look in history, we're not looking at abstractions and waves and movements, so to speak, but we're looking at the deeds of beings in relationship with each other.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah? So that means then, when we look at a phenomenon like the New World Order and the people who are working within it, then we have to ask ourselves, who are these people? We've got to see what impulses do they carry, in what ways do they operate, what attitudes do they have to the people they operate with, to their own subordinates, and to humanity in general. How do they regard for example, do we see them as regarding humanity as a flock, as the church used to do, or as the Egyptian pharaohs and the priests of ancient times would do? Yeah. Now, I don't see that, again, as a negative thing. The child between the age of 7 and 14 requires authority. The child wants a healthy authority from its parents. And that's what the parents should give a child.
Yeah.
Safety, nothing sadistic, but safe, clear authority, so the child can feel safe and grow up within that feeling of safety between those years. Yeah. But from puberty onwards, the child needs freedom. And the point, if one takes into consideration the idea of reincarnation, one can think then that working in within the New World Order are not only conscious initiates, people who, for example, in their previous lives would have been conscious initiates and hierophants of one kind or another, but also people who would have been their disciples, their pupils, who would be less conscious, who would be semi-conscious, or would be perhaps almost entirely unconscious, but who would carry those impulses from a previous life into this.
So they're fulfilling a role here.
Exactly. So they would feel that they still need, for whatever reason it may be, that they have not picked up, for example, on, say, what Steiner would call the Christ impulse, this impulse to brotherhood. You see, this impulse to freedom and brotherhood, that they haven't picked up on that, so that they return to Earth. And he basically says that we have approximately, in the norm, 2 incarnations every 2,160 years. So in each different age, you have 2 incarnations, once in general, once as a man, once as a woman. And so you might come back, 2,000 years later. A lot has happened in the meantime, but you carry on a certain impulse, yeah, which then leads you to behave in a certain way. And this means that we need to look very carefully at what lives in the will and the way that certain individuals, take, for example, an individual like David Rockefeller or Zbigniew Brzezinski or these kind of people, how they operate in the world, how they behave. Yeah? So this element of considering personal reincarnation is an important one, particularly because we in the West, we don't see that we tend not to see that. And so we can easily think, well, the New World Order phenomenon is just, it could either be aliens, the Nibiru thesis, for example,
sure.
or it could be, it's just these power-hungry Babylonian priests, and there's descendants, their bloodline descendants, that is, yeah? But it's not necessarily bloodline at all. You see what I'm saying?
So this could be that they are. This is how they manage to keep the agenda going for such a long period. In one sense, we could look at it that they're actually reincarnating back in again in one sense, and their role is to perpetuate this structure and this system for the purpose of our evolution, if you will.
Absolutely so, Henrik. And Steiner pointed out during the First World War, for example, he pointed out, we're looking at the Western, what he called the Western Brotherhoods of that time, because he gave a remarkable course of lectures. I'd like to just mention this for your listeners if they get hold of it. It's called, this course of lectures is called The Karma of Untruthfulness. The Karma of Untruthfulness. It's in 2 volumes. And it's it was like a kind of applied media course, you could say, for the people of his time, helping them to try to understand the signs of the times, even in the press, the popular literature, and so on and so forth. Of, what was, for example, the First World War all about? How had that come about, that phenomenon? And he was helping the people to see, to understand what was working within the movements of the time. And one of the points he referred to was how that war had been set up. And this is really how I in a sense, how I got into all of this, because I was very interested in the First World War, as I said earlier, in the first hour. And I'd never been satisfied with the causes of the academic explanations of the causes of the war, do you see? And so when I came across his thoughts, these were thoughts which were so they were so interesting and so radical and coming from such a different perspective, and were so stimulating, that I wanted to follow this through and see if I could bear these out. And so one of the things he referred to was, well, 2 things actually. One was that the war, you could trace back certain maps, hence later my book, Mapping the Millennium, to the late 19th century in the Western Brotherhoods, which were looking forward, as it were, to the Great War. That was one point. And the second point was, and that these brotherhoods carried out certain ceremonial rituals by which they were able to stay in touch with their members who had crossed the threshold, who had died. So they were able to stay in touch with the members of their former lodges, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you see there's a spiritual chain, therefore, is continued between the generations, so the living and the dead. And this is something else which some researchers have found difficult to understand, the very question you just asked.
Yes.
How is it that this goes on for such a long time, do you see? So this is one of the points he raises in those lectures. But the maps question, when he referred to these maps, you see, and then I also I thought to myself, well, can one see any evidence today? And this is the late 80s. I was thinking this. Yeah, I read those books of his in 1988. I said, can one see any evidence of this today? Of these of these maps, or the way these ideas are mediated to the public? And I came across in 1990 a very, very interesting map, which you'll find on my website, in The Economist. And I've now been The Economist is a magazine which is really, I think, is very, very deeply connected with all of this. And you'll find on in Bilderberg sites, for example, that The Economist is the only magazine that is allowed to post rapporteurs at Bilderberg meetings, for example.
Really?
They're always, by which I mean rapporteur. I don't know why they use that Frenchified word, but obviously it means reporter. Yeah, they always call them rapporteur. But obviously there are heads of media companies attending Bilderberg. That's not what I mean. I mean people who are there, as it were, note takers, I suppose, yeah, and who would then report back. The only problem is they don't report back to their readers.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they only report to the people who are there, you see.
Yep.
But it means that a magazine like The Economist always knows what's going on in detail at Bilderberg meetings, because they have their guys at each one of those meetings, and that's been the case for years and years and years. So to gain these are people, in my view, who really understand the score, what's going on from the New World Order perspective. And I would just flag up 2 things, Henrik, because I'm aware of time, in this connection. One is the Economist. The Economist magazine, and if your readers again can read about this on my website, The Economist magazine of the week of the first week of September 1990, and I analyze this in detail in my book, Mapping the Millennium. That, by the way, of course, is the week of 9/11, 1990, and that's when that is when George Bush Sr. announced the New World Order.
Indeed.
Yeah, in that particular week, and in that issue, The Economist put forward a remarkable 16-page spread on the emerging scenario, and we're now global scenario in the post-Cold War era. And they laid out the whole picture, which we have now become familiar through from works like Clash of Civilizations by Huntington and Grand Chessboard by Brzezinski and so on. This was already there, Henrik, in 1990 in The Economist, you see. That shows you how connected these people were. Yeah? Huntington's book didn't come out in Foreign Affairs, I think it was, until 93, and then his book a year or two later. Yeah? But there it is in The Economist, in essence, namely that the struggle in the 21st century will not be a struggle based on economics, such as capitalism versus communism, but it will be a struggle based on culture and religion. In other words, spirit and ideas. Yeah, and that relates very much to another. Well, perhaps I should come back to that later. But it's just that they are working, Henrik, with half truths. They're working with something which is spiritually true, but they're giving it a spin, and that has to do with the fact that since the 1880s we have indeed been living in an age of spirit and ideas, and that's called in the esoteric world the age of Michael. The age of the Archangel Michael. The signature of that age is cosmopolitanism and spiritualization of thinking. Whereas the signature of the previous age, the age of the Archangel Gabriel, which is approximately 350 odd years, was a time when human beings were focused particularly on this world of the physical world. And so you have the natural science developing, you have the technology developing, you have nationalism developing, you have material culture developing, all kinds of ways. That was these archangels Gabriel and Michael are sort of archetypes in a sense for birth and death, you see. A concern with this world, the gate of birth, coming into this world, which is everything to do with science, natural science. And then Michael is the spiritual sciences, which is where one relates one's thinking not so much to the five senses, but to the world of the invisible. Yeah? So that's the world which we are now living in now, hence the whole New Age phenomenon.
And do you see then that also that this genuine urge in human beings for a new era, if you will, a new spiritual rebirth, as it were, that this is something that is being hijacked by the controlling elements, by the New World Order, because they know, as you say, they have to keep an eye on this, and they know that this is an energy that is coming in one sense, but they want to keep themselves at the top that you described before. But in order to do that, they're going to give us the artificial version of that in order to stay in power themselves. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's exactly it, yeah. And this is, again, Steiner pointed out this in this so-called media course I mentioned, the Karma of Untruthfulness, back in the First World War time. So that's exactly what the United Nations is a very good example of this. League of Nations, United Nations. Yeah?
Yes.
That they understand that living in the will of humanity, living in the modern will of humanity, unconsciously or semi-consciously, is a will for a cosmopolitan world. Is a will to go beyond the world of nation fights against nation.
So how do people what do you say there? How do people discern here, and how do people know which one is the artificial and the real one, if you know what I mean?
Well, what they have to do, I mean, for example, you'll find many left-wing people and so-called social progressives regard the League of Nations and the United Nations as almost sacrosanct, yeah? But what you will also find, Henrik, is that these people have not studied the history of it. If you go in and you look at the history of the League of Nations and the United Nations and you see who is behind it, and who are the individuals? It's always individuals. One must look at the individuals. Yeah? Who are the individuals who created the British Commonwealth? The individuals who created the United Nations? What were their motivations? Yeah? This is what doesn't happen, Henrik. And if one does that, this is one of the ways in which history can help us, and which is what the truth movement is, which Ian Crane's always talking